All right, so I'm Jacob Swanner. I'm going to talk about active record scopes and Arel. So I think before we can kind of get started as far as where we are now with scopes and stuff, it's kind of important to know where we came from, how Rails has evolved over time, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of why things are the way they are, and maybe where things are going to go in the future, and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go back before, basically, how Rails was before 2.1 in this respect. So basically, you had find methods, and you gave this find method a hash of options. But there was no built-in reuse of those options. If you were going to use the same kind of conditions and things multiple times, there was nothing built in to help you reuse that. You could write a method or something that returned that options hash, but that was about the best thing you could do. So here's a couple of examples of how you would do things. Find actually has a bunch of different modes of operation. You know, you can give it a number, and it's going to look for a record with that ID. I'm not talking about any of that kind of stuff. It's mostly things along these lines. So in this first example, we have an author model, and we're trying to get the first one where the name is Bob. So in the options hash, you'd specify its conditions, name equals. This question mark will get replaced with the value that follows it, so in this case, Bob. The next example, we're going to look for all books where the title is foo, actually where the title contains foo. And we're going to order it by title, right? So this is kind of an example of a couple of ways that you would query records out of the database. But again, there was no way of reusing any of these conditions, any of the ordering, any of that kind of stuff. So 2.1 came around and actually changed some of this stuff. So first thing was it introduced name scope. Name scope was basically Nick Kalin's HasFinder plugin, just rolled in right into Rails. And what it allowed you to do basically was to reuse those query options. And it also allowed for composition or chaining of these scopes that you'd create. And so if you made these scopes really granular, then you can kind of build them up and pull the records that you wanted out using multiple of these scopes. So here's an example, or a couple of them actually. So first one we have is a name scope we call published, and basically we're saying an author is published when the number of books that they have is greater than 0, right? So you say you use the class method name scope, you give it a name, so published, and then you give it whatever it is that you're trying, whatever it is the options for this query. So the conditions here, books count greater than 0. Then we have another example by first name. So here we're using a lambda. We're using a lambda because this scope needs an attribute. It needs a argument. So we're saying whenever this thing gets invoked, we're going to give it an argument, and we want that argument to match. So I'm sorry, I'm going all the way. So anyway, so we want to say anywhere where the first name matches whatever the thing that's given to us. So it's kind of best to see it in examples. So down below you actually see it. So we have author.published. We're using that first scope that was created. And then by first name Bob. So we're going to find all the authors that are published whose first name is Bob, right? So that was, this is what came around with Rails 2.1. This is kind of what you could do at that point in time. So then Rails 3 came along, and Rails 3 actually made a lot of changes regarding how you query the database. Kind of the smallest change was that name scope became scope. Just got a little shorter, but same kind of thing. Also, it introduced a whole bunch of query methods to active record. And basically those query methods are just the options from that hash, but they were pulled out into separate methods that you could call. So for instance, in the options hash before, there was a conditions section, and that now became a where method. And then where you would say order before, it was now an order method, those kinds of things. And then the composability or the chainability was extended to all those query methods. So if you can just put on a bunch of these wheres together. So you can say where author, where first name is Bob, where city is this, where height is whatever. You can just kind of chain all these together. So here's a couple, well, same examples from before, just using the Rails 3 way of doing things. So again, name scope is now just called scope. You still say the same thing, published, but now it's where the books count is greater than 0. And then by first name, again, we're using a lambda because we want to take in an argument. Now you can see down below at the bottom when we're actually using these scopes, the way you use the scopes didn't change with Rails 3. It was just the way that you define them changed, which is really helpful because all the code where you're using all your scopes, that didn't need to change at all with Rails when you moved to Rails 3. Only the defining of them needed to change. So now that we kind of have like a little bit of a history, now we can kind of see, we can start looking at how we can kind of use scopes better. So here's a scope called name contains, and basically we're going to find all the authors where the name contains whatever value that we're going to pass into this scope. So in SQL, you do it with like. And again, this question mark will get replaced by whatever the value comes after it. So in this case, whatever the argument comes in, we're going to wrap it in these percent signs. That basically makes it a little token saying, you know, it allows you to match anywhere within the value of the name column. So anyway, so our scope, it works great. You know, it's doing exactly what we want. It's finding all the authors where the name is within that column. But we're starting to get reports that when we go to production, we're not getting the same results back. It's not performing the same. Well, we're using Heroku, right, for production. And well, Heroku uses Postgres. So let's say locally in development we were using SQLite or MySQL or whatever else. Why would this be a problem? Well, like in Postgres is case sensitive. So it's not going to perform, it's not going to act the same on different databases. So that's our problem. All right, well the fix is pretty simple, right? We just change like into ILIKE, and now it works case insensitive in Postgres, right? So we're good to go. Well, not quite. Other databases don't support ILIKE. So now we're no longer working in SQLite, MySQL, all these other things. All right, fine. So we'll just switch all of our environments over to Postgres. We'll just use Postgres everywhere. And in many scenarios, that's probably fine. But what if you're not writing an application? What if you're writing a library? You're writing something where you don't know the environment in which it's going to run on. Now you're dictating that all the users of this library that you're making have to use Postgres. That seems kind of silly. There are plenty of reasons to commit yourself to a particular database, like Postgres or whatever else. You know, maybe you want to use that database's geospatial library, or you want to use Postgres's full text search or something. That's fine. Those I think are probably more valid options for sticking to just one database. But to me, making yourself have to use Postgres because of ILIKE seems pretty silly. So there should be a better way of doing this. And, well, there's one possible solution is to use Arel. So one thing is, I don't know how to pronounce this word. I don't know if it's Arel or Arel. I tend to say both. Usually Arel, but I also don't even know how to spell it, like the capitalization. In its own README, that R is capitalized twice in the README. In every other reference, it's not capitalized. So I don't know how to even, you know, write the damn thing. But anyway, well, what is it? Well, it's a relational algebra library. Who knows what that really means? But it's used internally by Active Record. So all those methods that I was talking about, like where internally is using Arel, order, all these other methods that you can kind of chain together, all of them under the covers are all using Arel. And so basically what happens is Active Record uses Arel to generate the SQL that Active Record then sends to your database. It's just basically a SQL generation library is basically what it boils down to. So let's look at a quick primer of how you use Arel. So, well, that's not going to make a whole lot of sense. So let's break this down real quick. So here we're grabbing the table that we want to query on. We're defining the table. So in this case, we want to look at the authors table. And then we want to query on a particular column of that table, in this case, name. So this is how you specify the particular column you want to operate on. Then the operator you want to use. In this case, we want to use, you know, we're just doing an equivalence match. Equals. And then the value that you want to search for. So put it all together, and we want to find all authors where the name equals Amy. So it's a little verbose, but hopefully you kind of see how it works. And then this is a SQL that'll come out of it. Select star from authors where authors.name is Amy. And then if you're actually using active record, you don't have to go through that first line of Arel table new authors. Active record just gives you this Arel table method that you can call on all your models, and you'll get back that same object. All right, so now let's use Arel for that problem scenario that we had earlier. So here we just say Arel table name, right, because that's the column we want to operate on. And we use matches. So Arel provides a matches predicate, a matches method that we can use. And then we just give that the value that we want to match on. So in this case, it's just the value that comes in as an argument wrapped in those same % signs. And that's it. So now, when you run this scope on Postgres, you're going to get ILIKE. And if you're on anything else, you're going to get like. If you actually want like on Postgres, you're going to have to write that string that was at the very beginning. But that's a different story. All right, so let's look at some other ways in which you can kind of use Arel here. So here's a scenario where we're going to grab all the authors that live in Orlando, and their name is Bob. So you can see the SQL that comes out. Select star from authors where city is Orlando, name is Bob. But what about if we don't want to just find Bobs? We want to find Carols as well. So how would you do that with active record? Well, here's one example using a SQL fragment. So we say where the city is Orlando, but then the next bit's the important part. So we say where name is question mark or name is question mark, right? And so these question marks are going to get replaced by the values that follow it. So it's going to be where name is Bob or name is Carol. So that works. It'll give us what we want. We'll get back Bobs and Carols. But there's another option. You can use Arel. So I start out by grabbing the column that we want to operate on, name, and we just say where the city is Orlando, name equals Bob or name equals Carol. Now where it gets a little funky here is the or bit. Let me see if this laser works. All right, yeah, cool. So where it gets a little weird is you see this equals, and what comes back from equals, the return here where it closes, we then say dot or. And then or is another method, and what we pass into or is name equals Carol. So it's a little weird because there's like this method and you pass in the name equals thing into it. But it works. It gives us what we want. So anyway, so that's just how that works. So if you want to ever do ORs, you can do it with Arel, or you can do it the string way. I prefer the Arel option, but anyway. Also, I think let's say if you were having to programmatically build up a whole list, like in this case we're just looking at 2, but if you were going to have to look at a variable number and you don't know what it is, and you're given a method, or the method that you're writing is giving an array, I think it would be easier to loop over that array and use the methods and build up that query that you want, as opposed to doing like string concatenation or whatever it is to do it that first way. But whatever. So let's look at some other things. So let's say you wanted to do an in operation. So a pretty typical way of doing it is like this, using a SQL fragment. So you're saying name is in, and again the question mark will get replaced. In this so we'll get name is in Bob or Carol. So that way we'll get back all the authors whose name is Bob or Carol. So this is another way of solving that previous scenario, just not with an or. But I don't like this way of doing things. You're probably thinking there's a better way. You're probably thinking there's a way of doing this in Arel, and well, there is. So again, you just get the table and the column, so name. Arel provides this in predicate, this in method that you can use. So you just say name in, and you give that method an array. So in this case, it's an array of Bob or Carol. And then you get back that same, so it'll give you the same exact SQL as the first one. And you'll get back all the authors whose name is Carol or Bob. But I actually don't like this way either. This is actually a better way. Go ahead.
Quick question. Does the second way do the SQL injection sanitization also? Or are you vulnerable?
No, it's fine. You do the sanitization. Sorry, the question was, does the second way sanitize what you would get from the first one? And yes, it does. So there's, like I said, there's a better way. You can actually just use where with the hash way of doing where better. So that hash that you give where, you give it, like I said, you give it a hash, and a hash is a name, it's a key value pair. And in that pair, if the value is an array, it'll cause n to be used. So you don't have to do anything special other than just give an array as the value to the hash. So that's the way I would do n if you ever need to do n. All right. So what if you need to do between in your SQL query? So in this case, we want to look at where the count is between 1 and 5. So you're probably thinking there's a better way, probably thinking there's an Arel way. There is. It's pretty similar to the one we just looked at. You actually use the exact same method in, but instead of giving in an array, you give in a range. So 1.5 is a range from 1 to 5. And so you just give that to in, and what you get back when it actually goes into SQL will be a between query. But there is a better way of doing this one as well, and hopefully you figured it out by now. And it's also using that hash into where, and it's just the value of that key value pair. If it's a range, it causes, well, it actually calls that same in method under the covers, and since that's a range, it'll cause between method to get, or a between operator to get used in SQL. All right, so you probably figured out by now, I don't like the SQL fragment way of doing things in what you give to where. And I'll give you another example of why I don't like that. So here we have two models, author and book. And they both have a scope on them called by name. Doesn't matter that the scopes are called the same. It's just that they happen to be doing the exact same thing, essentially. And all they're doing is they're looking for authors whose name is equal to whatever the value is given to it. And they're looking for books whose name is equal to the values given to it. So down below, you can see where we're using it. So book by name, The Art of War. And then we're joins on this other table. And so I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but you can actually merge in scopes from other models. You're not just stuck using scopes on the model that you start with. So we want to merge in the scope by name from author. And so what we're doing here is we want to find all the books whose name is The Art of War, and the author's name is Sun Tzu. So this is how you'd use those scopes. But when you actually go to invoke it, you're going to run into a problem. Because even though these scopes work independently just fine, when you do this query down here, because the query is on two tables, both of which contain a name, and in your where clause, you're referencing this name thing, it doesn't know which name you're talking about. It doesn't know if you're talking about the name column on authors or the name column on book. And so you get this ambiguous column name error. So, well, how would you resolve this ambiguous column name error? Well, you'd put authors here, like authors.name and books.name. That would be one way of preventing the ambiguous column name error. Another way is don't use the SQL fragment, don't use the string. Just use a hash or use Arel or whatever, and you won't have that possibility, essentially. So, but you do see, now granted, these examples I'm using the equal, see that's kind of silly because I could have just used the hash to begin with, but I just wanted a simple example of using a SQL fragment. So I just avoid those things at all costs. And again, if you do have to use them, make sure that you prefix with the table name. So anyway, so that's that. All right, so then other things that I don't like, again, these are just opinionated things. You can do whatever you want. This is just what I think. So let's say you have I don't like scopes with lambdas, right? So I've shown you several examples of them because they're shorter. But there's a few reasons why you would make a scope with a lambda. So in this case, we're using a lambda because we want to take in an attribute, take in an argument. But you don't need to do that. I don't like this syntax. Also, another reason why you might use a lambda is if your scope is dealing with time, like time.now. An example of that might be if you're trying to find all users that have been created in the last 5 minutes. If you do that and you start your server, you might find some users that were created in the last 5 minutes, but let's say 10 minutes from now, you look at that same page, you're going to get the exact same results you got back when you were on it 10 minutes ago. And obviously, they weren't created in the last 5 minutes. And the reason is because time.now got evaluated when that class got loaded. And so like you're stuck in time, basically. So you wrap it in Lambda, so that way your scope isn't like stuck in time, if you will. But I don't like that. I don't like using Lambdas to solve that either. Also, I don't like using this scope class method for really long scopes. When they start getting really long, I don't like using it. So I keep saying I don't like this stuff, but I'm not telling you what to do otherwise. So like the other option is just use class methods. So you'd use them exact same. It's just the way that you define the scopes are slightly different. So you just make a method, and then the name of it is just self dot whatever your normal name is, and you just that's it really. So in this scenario, we're using the Lambda to have an argument. Well, class methods can take arguments, so that resolves that. If you're using a Lambda for time.now or some other kind of time thing, well, you don't have to worry about it either because time.now won't get evaluated until a method actually gets called. So you resolve that issue as well. So I really, like I said, I don't like scopes with Lambdas, and I don't really like long scopes. I don't mind that this scope class method up here if it's like really short. If it's just scope some name comma where success true or something like that. That seems fine. But when they start getting really long and when they start using Lambdas tend to make them longer. That's when I start not to like them. There might be some changes in this realm in the future. There was at one point in time in Rails trunk, like in the master branch, whatever, they had ripped out the support for this Lambda thing, so you couldn't use this. They ripped it out in favor of the class method, but within about 24 hours, I think that commit got reverted, so that support was put back in Rails. And now it's looking like the support where you're not using a Lambda is not going to be supported. So I don't know. I might be using class methods for all my scopes in the future. So anyway, we'll see what happens in Rails in the future as far as scopes go. All right, so Arel, I only showed you a few examples of what you can do in Arel as far as those predicates, as far as those methods available to you. But there's quite a few. So here's a list of all the predicates, equal, not equal, n, not n, yada, yada, yada. Greater than or less than, it's another one. So, if you want to do a greater than less than query in Rails, typically you have to go through the string thing. You don't have to. You can do it in code if you use Arels. And then all of these things, you can also suffix it. You can append all or any, and those things take arrays. So you can say equal all, and then you give that an array so that whatever the name or whatever that column is you're trying to match on, they all have to match that. Anyway, there's a whole bunch is what I'm trying to tell you. There's a whole lot of these methods you can use. But another thing you might want to look at is this library called Squeel. It basically exposes all those predicates, that whole list I was just showing you, or most of that list. It allows you to do it without having to go through Arel, right? So all three of these are equivalent. So instead of having to do this like Arel table thing and then this matches, Squeel just lets you do this, right? But the one thing you want to keep in mind is that these aren't parens. These are actually curly braces because this is a block of code being evaluated. It's a little detail, but it's an important detail to make this work right. So anyway, so yeah, like I said, you might want to look into this. Again, it just exposes all those underlying predicates in a nicer way. So that's really all I have. I'm Jacob Swanner. That's my Twitter handle. I work at Invi Labs, the company behind Code School, which is the company behind Try Ruby and Rails for Zombies and those things. So any questions?
Squeel is just like a simple DSL for Arel stuff. I don't have to worry about performance issues or anything in that regard, do I?
It's a good question. I mean, there's going to be, I don't know. I haven't done any kind of performance metrics as far as it really goes, but I mean, I guess you're going to have somewhat of an overhead because there's more code and there's more steps involved, but I don't think it's going to be too heavy of of a thing, of abstraction. Yes, in the back.
I think my question is somewhat related, but do you know Squeel uses the Ruby parse tree stack?
I have, all right, well, I guess everyone heard how what he asked, but I have no idea how Squeel's implemented. I was just bringing it up for like, I actually have never used it. But, so I can't like vouch for it, but I just know it looks pretty promising. It just hit 1.0 like yesterday or today or something. So it's, anyway, I mean, it's been around for a while, but and it looks pretty cool, but I just haven't used it myself. Any other question? Yeah.
Yeah, when you define that function with self dot, whatever the function tool is,
Yeah.
what's going on over there?
This one?
Yeah.
What was the question? I'm sorry. So,
What's the difference between the two?
well, as far as use goes, you use them exactly the same. It's just the definition. So here we're explicitly making it a class method by saying def self.firstname, whereas this one we're going through code. You know, Rails provides this scope class method, and then it's a DSL essentially. It's doing creating the class method essentially. So here we're just being explicit in creating the class method, and here we're going through Rails to create the scope for us. But because but the reason why we have to use this lambda keyword right here is because we want to take in an argument, right? And that's the only reason why we have this lambda keyword here. If you weren't taking in an argument, if it was just going to be like where success true or something like that, you could get rid of all this crap and you get rid of this curly brace. You wouldn't need any of that. Anyway, so it's just a different way of defining the scopes. I prefer this one, but this is an option. That's all, really. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anything else? Good, I think the conference is over for the day anyway, so. All right, I guess there's keynotes and stuff, but this time block is over. So thanks a lot.